Hi Year 11 and welcome to this short session on the poem Exposure by Wilfred Owen. Thank you to Flaviana for requesting this one. I think it's a great one to make sure that you are confident with, as it links to so many poems in the anthology. So when you're ready and you've got something to write with or make notes in, continue watching along. So, in a nutshell, this poem can very much be themed with our nature and war clusters. It's obviously focused on Wilfred Owen's personal experiences of fighting in World War One. Obviously, sadly, in terms of personal context, Owen lost his life in 1918, and most of his poems were published posthumously, so after he died. But this poem really focuses on that kind of collective, first-hand experience of warfare. So, in the poem, Owen describes the physical and psychological trauma caused by frontline fighting, as we've already said, told through that first hand perspective. The poem is written in collective first person pronouns, our brains ache, we. So, it's that real idea about this shared experience as well. The poem begins with in media res. So, as I've just said there, our brains ache. We start off immediately in this conflict, not with the enemy as we might expect in warfare, but with nature itself. And because we see nature attacking the soldiers, there's this constant sense of waiting and anticipation for the conflict that should be arriving, the conflict that we would expect with the actual enemy soldiers, and that never actually appears. So the freezing temperatures are presented as being just as deadly as the enemy soldiers through the sustained personification that is used. And the vulnerability and growing weakness of the soldiers is presented as the poem continues, particularly through the metaphorical shift from the focus on the personified weather, the ice winds, the pale flakes, to the juxtaposition with the dark red jewels of the fires at home. Those kind of final stanzas where we get that shift, where they're almost hallucinating because they're so cold and their bodies are shutting down, and they imagine themselves back at home. They imagine the reasons for their fighting, which is contrasted with the kind of frigidness of the environment, of the weather around them. And then finally, the repeated refrain at the end of each stanza really emphasizes that feeling of anticlimax. So at the end of the first and the last stanza, we get but nothing happens, really emphasizing, as we said, that anticlimax and demonstrating the soldiers' helplessness along with the futility of war. Owens, as you might remember from your study in Year 9, is a poet who constantly focuses on the futility of war and the pointlessness of the soldiers' sacrifices, and we can see that really clearly in this poem as well. So one thing that's really obvious in this poem is the huge amount of personification that is used throughout. So I've picked out some of the phrases here that jump out the most. Our brains ache in the merciless ice east winds that knife us. That first line of the poem, we get that immediate dynamic verb, knife us, it's attacking them. And it's obviously, if we think about a knife, the damage a knife can cause, if we compare it to the use of the bayonets, as we see in Bayonet Charge, but in World War One, you've got that enemy imagery that is being given over into the hands of the weather, almost suggesting a sense of kind of omnipotence as well, because we cannot escape from the weather. Watching, we hear the mad gusts tugging on the wire. So this idea again of the wind being kind of like mad, causing this kind of like physical chaos, tugging on the wire being the barbed wire around the trenches, no man's land. Dawn, massing in the east her melancholy army, attacks once more in ranks on shivering ranks of grey. So normally we associate dawn and that kind of metaphorical symbolism of dawn as a new day, fresh start. It's normally associated with like hope. Here, that meaning is completely juxtaposed. It's massing in the east, it's gathering together a melancholy army, melancholy kind of like saddening, and attacking the soldiers with rain, ranks on shivering ranks of grey. That military language here, massing, army, ranks, really again emphasising the link between nature and warfare. Less deadly than the air that shudders black with snow, the idea of the air shuddering, with sidelong flowing flakes that flock, pause, and renew. I feel like with that last line there, there's almost a sense of a deliberate consciousness, which again links to the personification. The weather is making a deliberate choice to negatively impact the soldiers, which again builds that sense of them being the enemy. The real enemy is out there, but actually the real enemy in this poem is the nature itself. And we can see that in that final quotation, pale flakes with fingering stealth come feeling for our faces. Get some beautiful fricative alliteration with the FFF, as if it's the sound of snowflakes falling onto the ground. I'm going to talk about that on the next slide, actually, the soundscape of the poems. But particularly that idea of them kind of like reaching out for faces. Faces may be quite a vulnerable part of us, a part of our identity. So the idea that the snow and the weather is reaching for them makes it almost quite monstrous here. So the soundscape of the poem, I mentioned this on the other slide. Essentially, a soundscape is just exactly what it sounds. We talk about landscape; it would be kind of like the land and in the like the picture or something. When we talk about soundscape, we're thinking about how it sounds. So this is a poem which is full of sound, and there is a reason for that. What I want you to think about is when we think of war poetry, when we think of war, what sounds fill your mind? You've probably thought of something that is really aggressive, really jarring, really discordant, cacophonous, to get some of that ambitious vocabulary in, something that sounds really chaotic. Now, this poem is really interesting because whilst we have that language, we can also see that there's this sense of silence, which links to the waiting, the anticlimax. So, part of the first stanza, we get these lines: low drooping flares confuse our memory of the salient. Worried by silence, sentries whisper, curious, nervous. And I've really kind of tried to emphasize some of that sibilance there, but nothing happens. So again, in this stanza, the end of the first stanza, we get this real deliberate sense of sibilance being built up, those repeated S sounds, which when you say them, it sounds like people whispering. It sounds like people scared to break the silence of warfare. But also on the flip side of that, does it sound like the wind whistling through the trenches? Does it sound that cold kind of sound? Does it sound like a more dangerous hissing of the weather? In the same way that then we see in the fourth stanza, sudden successive flights of bullets streak the silence. Again, sibilance. Here, it seems to be reflecting the actual bullets themselves as they whiz through the air. But those bullets are less deadly than the air that shudders black with snow, with sidelong flowing flakes that flock, pause, and renew. So again, we get this sibilance, shudders, snow, sidelong flakes. We get the soft fricative Fs coming in, the idea of the flakes themselves, as we've said, and we watch them wandering up and down the wind's nonchalance, but nothing happens. And again, that kind of repeated alliterative W's, we watch them wandering up and down the wind's nonchalance, almost creates this sense, again, of kind of like pause and helplessness. All they can do is watch and wait for what's going to attack them. So I think when you're talking about this poem, if this poem comes up in your exam, there's a real point to be made about the sound and the sound language that's used in this poem. So as always, key terms and comparison poems. So key terms for this poem we've talked about in media res with other poems, but starting in the middle of the action, creating that sense of kind of confusion, discombobulation. We've got the sibilance, the repeated S sounds that we've just talked about in the soundscape on the other slide. And we've got that refrain, that word, phrase, in this case line, that's repeated at regular intervals. So constantly at the end of every single stanza, creating that anticlimax, but nothing happens, etc., 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 because it varies slightly, but particularly cyclically on the first and the last stanza, starting and ending with that, but nothing happens, emphasizing that futility of warfare, as we've already said. So what poems can we compare it to? I personally love Exposure, and one of the reasons that I love it is because I think you can compare it to so many poems. So it compares really nicely to our nature poems, Storm on the Island, the Prelude, looking at the power of nature over humans, the powerlessness of humans compared to nature, if you want to flip it. We could look at Remains, a war photographer, and thinking about traumatic experiences that soldiers go through due to warfare. We could look at Charge of Light Brigade or Bayonet Charge, think about reality of conflict. Charge of Light Brigade, you could also look at that idea of like experiences of war. So if it was in obviously both of those, they're collective experiences, they're a group of soldiers. Or in Charge of Light Brigade, obviously the cavalry, the Light Brigade. Whereas again, if we're going to look at experiences in warfare and contrast it with Bayonet Charge or Remains or War Photographer, they're individual poems, they're individual stories. So there's loads of connections that can be made here with this poem. As always, we have our wonderful knowledge snapshot from the wonderful Stuart Pryke. You can obviously take a picture of this, pause it. It's obviously quite small, so you can kind of zoom in and magnify it. But this just goes through lots more details and lots of other helpful things about this poem. So hopefully that's been useful for you. Kept it to roughly 10 minutes this time, so you're welcome. And yeah, keep working hard, guys. It's all going to pay off. Go well, and remember, if you found this video helpful, do please like and subscribe to our Cedars YouTube channel. Well done, guys. Take care.